I'm going to be speaking about consciousness, but I'm also going to be speaking about trauma, specifically infant trauma. It's one of those tricky traumas that can last all the way into adulthood, and we may not be aware that this trauma is lying within us, lying within the body. The body remembers everything, you know, from infancy through adulthood, and it really carries the burdens of any unresolved traumas that we have. You know, one of the reasons I really want to talk about infant trauma as well is if we've endured that, it can really eclipse our sense of wholeness as we grow into adulthood. We rarely remember the first 2 to 3 years of our life, so we don't have these cognitive memories of what happened to us. But as I said, the body may remember everything that does. There's many types of infant trauma that can happen. I'm going to narrow it down even more, and I'm going to speak about infant neglect. And the reason I'm going to do that is I think we can shift this cultural milieu that's still happening in our culture where infants get neglected. And if I define neglect for a moment, neglect is simply the absence of the necessary elements of life, so sustenance, touch, love, obviously, holding, eye contact, etc. So by talking about this, I can bring a little bit more education and awareness around it and help those infants who may suffer from neglect. And also, we may be able to reflect on ourselves and see or discover if we endured any of that of ourselves and move forward to uneclipse what blocks us from experiencing wholeness. So this human body, this amazing, remarkable, and miraculous human body has been objectified, vilified, sinned against. It's been seen as a source of malevolence and uncertainty. And this has really disconnected us from the brilliance of our senses. It's created a disconnection to ourself, to nature, and to the cosmos. And this is a great tragedy for many reasons. One reason, if we look at what we're looking at this weekend in spirituality and in wholeness, the wisdom traditions tell us that we can find the absolute within. And when we enter into the body, specifically the heart area, when the heart opens through certain practices or by grace, we find this vast, open, boundless awareness. And we can take that as our perspective, so our vantage point of viewing life, so we're no longer identified to our ordinary self. And then from this vast, boundless awareness, that can turn back upon itself, illuminating itself to itself. And we find the absolute. And from that vantage point, to that perspective, we see all form, including the body, is the radiance of that. It is all light. It is no different than the formlessness. Right? So form and formlessness are the same. We've been hearing that this weekend. And that includes this miraculous, mysterious human body. So let me shift gears a little bit. Human beings are conscious. We're well aware of that. Consciousness and culture co-evolve in this intersubjective domain of interior consciousness. So as we work with ourselves through meditation and Western psychological processes, we are evolving, if you will, our consciousness. Our consciousness is able to potentiate itself more and more into creativity. And that will affect our culture. The more of us that we do it in our sanghas, in our communities, right, our culture begins to become more conscious. And this greater consciousness moves towards greater wholeness, right, greater complexity, and a greater sense of coherence and unity and love. However, if there has been trauma, that wholeness can become eclipsed, as I said earlier. I'm going to share with you a little story, a true story that I think encapsulates the essence of what it is I'm trying to portray. So it was a Sunday morning and the phone rang, and on the other end of the line, although it's not a line anymore, on the phone was a very, very distressed voice. And the person asked for me, and I said, how can I help you? And he said, I feel like I'm dying every moment. I was like, wow. Can you imagine that? And it was in a very distressed way. I feel like I'm dying every moment. And, I said, can you tell me a little bit more? And he said, well, about 2 weeks ago, an incident happened at work. It wasn't really a huge incident, but I felt a little bit betrayed. And from that betray has come this experience of feeling like I'm dying. And not only do I feel like I'm dying, but I feel like a great shame about it because I can't stop it and I can't see why I would be feeling like I'm dying. And I feel helpless and I feel hopeless. And I could feel the terror that he was feeling in my own body, even though he was hundreds of miles away, as I just was present to listening to him, right, and could resonate in his field. And so we did a little work on the phone, right, to help him calm his nervous system a little bit. And then he came to work with me. And what we discovered in our work together was something that his parents had told him. When he was an infant, they had to leave him in an orphanage for a few weeks. And, for whatever reasons, there didn't seem to be any choice. And they came back after a few weeks, and they said, when we came to pick you up, your eyes were vacant, as if there was nobody home, Anyway, this gentleman went on, he grew up and he went on to be very professional, a very, very successful professional life. And up until 2 weeks prior to the phone call that we had, he was still running his own business. He had a happy relationship, or he had a seemingly happy relationship. And he had no idea what this thing was inside him, but he said, well, maybe it has to do with something, the fact that when I was an infant, I was left in an orphanage. The other thing that he told me, and this is quite extreme, when his parents picked him up, he had a sore on his back. So that tells us at least there was neglect. Now, like I say, neglect is the lack of the necessary elements of life that sustain us, right? For a baby needs to be held, it needs to be touched, it needs to be loved, it needs eye contact for growth, for sustenance, to feel safe within its body. So you can imagine this little baby, this gentleman as a little baby, was left alone to cry, and cry when he needed something. And when an infant is left alone to cry, the energy in its body gets more and more and more, and it can actually reach a stage of rage. I don't know if any of you have seen a baby that's crying for something, and you can't quite give it to it, and it's red in the face. There's just this huge amount of sympathetic nervous system activation. And it takes quite some time to be able to calm them down. And when they're very young, between 0 to 6 months, it's the mother or the mother functioning figure, right? It's not always a female, sometimes it can be a male. The mother functioning figure needs to hold it and use her nervous system to calm the infant. Because for the first 6 months of life, our nervous system isn't fully online that allows us to calm ourselves, to soothe our body, to know how to begin to feel safe in the body. So here's this little baby screaming and nobody comes, and nobody comes, and nobody comes, in this hyper state of hyperarousal in the nervous system that becomes intolerable, unbearable. There's only an escape where, I think it was Putnam said, an escape where there is no escape, to dissociate. So we go from these really high states of hyperarousal from the sympathetic nervous system into this shutdown state. And it is the essence or the core self or our soul that disconnects, dissociates, or fragments. Let's just go with dissociation, okay? And then at some point, obviously, somebody came for this baby, and gave it food and took care of it, but didn't repair the dissociation that had taken place. And so this gentleman lived a life, as he said, in his mind. He never really thought too much about his body. He lived from his mind, and he was very brilliant and became very successful, as I said. He was also a seeker. He was also a meditator. And he also explored all kinds of self-exploration models and tools that we have around today. And he had a lot of glimpses, he said, of of awareness or of vastness, but everything was transient. Nothing stayed, nothing seemed to be embodied. And then, he was actually in his 60s, when this betray happened at work, unbeknownst to him, there was an experience of betray living in his body that triggered the remembrance of feeling like he was dying when he was an infant. So the past was very present. In every moment through the day, I feel like I'm dying and it's terrifying. In the nighttime, he would wake up in night terrors, sweating, feeling like he was falling into this horrifying void or this annihilation where there was just nothing, And he had no idea what to do about it. Fortunately, he did find somebody. Well, he found me. There's plenty of people who do work that I do that can help him to come back and re-embody and re-navigate this terrifying experience of infancy. But one of the things that we have to navigate to come back into the body is that huge amount of rage that the baby was experiencing when nobody came to pick him up. So that rage has to go somewhere. It tends to go back into the viscera, into the organs, into the joints. Some of it gets dissociated out along with our core self, our essence, our soul. So in the navigation or the resolution of this early trauma as an adult, we have to find a way to be able to contain and feel this tremendous rage. And of course, for our culture, we're really afraid of anger. We're really afraid of rage and terror. It's not a pleasant thing to feel. And if we've had any kind of trauma throughout our lives and have disconnected from our body, then we don't have a really great container to be able to experience the dissociated affect, this emotion. Whatever it is. Sometimes it's grief, sometimes it's sadness, sometimes it's anger and rage. So there's specific ways to be able to work and navigate and allow this soul essence to come back into the body while allowing the body to become a larger vessel or a larger container to feel all of these wonderful, wonderful human experiences from grief to sadness to anger and rage. Of course, they don't always feel wonderful when we're feeling them, but at some point you realize all of these human expressions are here for us to experience, for us to feel, for us to embody. And we've heard this weekend also that if you enter into these experiences, these emotions, right, within the very core of them, you can find the essence of ourself also. But if they're dissociated and we can't feel them in the body because they're too much, because they overwhelm our nervous system or just overwhelm us altogether, then we're really not going to be able to do that. So I really feel strongly that we need to be a culture that comes back to the body and learns how to feel the fullness of our human experience. And I don't believe for one moment it's an easy journey. I think it's tremendously courageous because we have to feel what was once unbearable and intolerable. I'm going to give you a quick glimpse of the history, just the last 85 years to 100 years, because all of us have been born and have lived within this time. Around the 1920s, there was a lot of orphanages and what we call foundling homes. Foundling because there was a lot of babies were found. At the time, having a baby out of wedlock wasn't, seen as something that was acceptable. So the orphanages and the foundling homes had a lot of babies and infants, and the death rate was very, very high. And along comes germ theory, and the pediatricians and doctors and so forth said, well, it's the babies and infants are dying because of germs, they're infecting each other. So let's separate all of the babies. Let's not pick them up. Let's not hold them. Let's not touch them. We'll give them a bottle when they cry because they're hungry. So a lot of these children and infants would just lie in these little cots or sheets, staring at the ceiling with a bottle, and then crying for somebody to come, crying for contact, and it wouldn't come. And so the death rate went even higher, It's pretty heavy, huh? There's good news at the end, I promise. Take a breath, big breath. Exhale. Yeah. So 1928, a gentleman named John Watson wrote a book called Psychological Care of Infant and Child. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it. It became a bestseller. Pediatricians, doctors, and parents all over the country followed what he said. And what he advocated is that we do not pick up our children when they cry. We do not cuddle them, we do not cuddle them, do not go, ooh, ah. Because if we do, we're going to ruin them and make them weak, spoiled human beings. That wasn't that many generations ago. That was my great-grandma. And I work with people today who come in and tell me, their parents told them when they were infants, the parents would be standing in the corner kind of terrified with this screaming child and not wanting to go pick it up because they didn't want to ruin it or spoil its life. Crazy. And of course, science has come so much further since then, and we know today there's attachment theory and so forth that is coming out and giving us all kinds of new information. However, we are still hearing from pediatricians and grandparents, to their children when they have children, oh, don't pick up the baby, leave it to cry itself to sleep. It needs to do that. Well, what happens when the baby cries and nobody comes to pick it up? It experiences fear. It's afraid. It goes beyond being hungry. It goes beyond being, needing its diaper changed. It needs to be held. And if nobody comes, it moves into a state of fear. And when you experience fear, now this goes for any of us at any time in our life, fear and you've got nowhere to go, you shut down and dissociate because it becomes unbearable. So even as an adult, if we're in a situation where we are terrified and we perceive inescapability, we're going to go into a state of tonic immobility or a state of, tonic immobility and dissociate. And it's very similar to the feigned death state that we see in animals, very similar. So a baby's moving into this preparatory death state, if you will, because when we experience so much fear and there's nowhere to escape, we just feel, right, because the baby's not thinking, we're feeling that we're going to die. So this preparatory death state gets catapulted out into the psyche, and that's what began to break through to the gentleman that I was working through who was feeling like he was dying every moment. So in coming to this talk, one of the things that I'm hoping that you can share and talk about is just this. Like this beautiful lady in the back holding and nurturing and cuddling her baby, how important that is, that we don't leave our babies alone. Yeah, everybody take a look, because that's going to calm your nervous system if, if the breath doesn't. And it can all be happening. It's all happening in non-duality. And you see, one of the things is we can get on a meditative path and experience non-dual awareness. And it's extraordinary for those of you who live there or experience it. The person who came to work with me had experienced that. But it wasn't the wholeness of who he was, it was only a part of him. His core self, his essence was still almost as if an infant in this state of preparing to die. Okay? So I really advocate coming back to the body and exploring our whole self and looking to see if there's any fragmented or split off or dissociated parts of ourself, so we can come back to this body as a localized self. Right? I don't think the self is necessarily one. I think it's many. It has many, many aspects. But we want them to be localized and embodied within this organism. Right? So when we get on a spiritual path, right, when we begin to awaken, it's experienced from the body. It's experienced in its wholeness. It's experienced in its fullness. And no part of us gets left behind. Another crazy fact, it was 1988 when the American Medical Association decided that infants were no longer primitive bundles of nerves. Crazy, huh? So can you imagine, prior to 1988? I mean, that was yesterday. that if an infant had surgery, they didn't use anesthesia because they didn't think it felt, I know, I'm sorry for saying it's horrifying. But it's important that we understand what's happened in our culture as a whole. Consciousness, right, co-evolves in the intersubjective domain, right, of our interior, or the interior domain of our consciousness, right? So it's important to know this as well. At this moment, does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Actually, Monica wrote a book, Touching, and he talks about that. And the least touching culture is England, and then Germany is even less touching. You know, like these cultures have taboo against touching. And the children are very raised like you just said, not being touched a lot.
Yeah.
While, you know, quote unquote primitive, or they used to call them primitive, now they call them indigenous culture, the mother constantly carries the baby on the sling, even when she works.
Yeah. We should wear our children for the first 6 months. I mean, really, we should sleep with our children. It's not always possible. Go ahead, finish.
But look at this, this guy was very successful, right?
Mm-hmm.
We live in a culture that was extremely successful in modifying their environment, right?
Yeah. Now we see the results. There's two things that can come from, well, there's probably many things, but two things that we're pretty sure of in the field that I work in. One is infant trauma, one is trauma in the first 6 months of life. And we dissociate, disconnect. That we either go to the mind, right, become very brilliant, and we can become very successful, and really uninterested in the body, or we learn how to fake it. Because the falsity of the self that lives in the world, is very, very good at pretending. And we have this self-care system that protects the innocence that was dissociated. Doesn't want us to, and this is all outside of our conscious awareness, it doesn't want us to go near it. Because if it does, then we've got to begin to feel what was once intolerable or unbearable, or the anger and the rage. And of course we don't want to do that because we don't have the container that's been built strong enough to be able to contain those emotions in an embodied way.
What's the other way? You said one way is up, going up into the head, dissociation.
The other way is to head off into spirituality in a very ungrounded way. And people have very, very authentic spiritual experiences, but it's not embodied. And, somehow I don't think this organism was an accident in the cosmos. I think it's meant to be here, and I think we're meant to be in it. And if we're not, we're missing out, as I said, on the brilliance of our senses, right? And our connection to nature and our connection to the cosmos. Because the cosmos is within here. We hear that from the wisdom traditions. Some of you may know it, right? If we're disconnected from this, it's less likely that we're going to be able to enter into this with our wholeness in a full way, right? And it's when we're really connected to this that we really feel our connection to nature, right? Back to a lot of indigenous cultures. Very connected to their bodies, very connected to nature. Yeah. Yes?
Can you talk more about the approach that you took in helping the individual in your story?
I'll speak a little bit about it. What I did mostly with this gentleman was I had my hands on his shoulders. I had him actually lie down on a body table. I had my hands on his shoulders and gave him some containment. So when we headed into this state of dying, he didn't have to do it alone. And when, we're talking about entanglement and presence this weekend, when we're very present with somebody, we can enter into states with them. It's usually better if you're working with someone if you've navigated those states yourself and then you don't get afraid. So I navigated these states of dying with him, and then of terror, and then of grief, because there was a tremendous amount of grief, as if there was life lost. Now, I don't know if there really was. He said that at first, and then he said, no, there wasn't. So there was a lot of holding, a lot of cooing, a lot of awing, using my voice, the prosody of my voice, to help him feel safe, kind of like his mama should have done, And that allowed him to come back. And as he came back, sheets and sheets of heat came off him with the rage, right? Coming out of his organs, his viscera, you know. And it was a big deal, you know. It wasn't a very gentle, easy, just present, nice time. It was a big deal for him. Very courageous, but he did it. And when he really felt himself coming back into his body, it was as if he'd awakened. The languaging that he was using was wonderful. He said, wow, this is who I really am. This is my authentic self. And we kept in touch over the following weeks, and he changed his profession, and he went to work in hospice. It's very, very profound, I thought. And he said every time he sees a tree, it's like seeing it for the first time. Every time he sees his wife, it's like seeing her for the first time, just like it is when we're awake, you know. So maybe he didn't awake to the fullness of the cosmos, although he's on that path, maybe he will. He awoke to the fullness and the wholeness of his human life. Yes, you were first.
Can you comment
Oh.
on having knowledge, say, on what an infant can sustain emotionally if there was severe trauma or a traumatic birth?
Mm-hmm.
There's a traumatic, the actual birth of a child, and there was trauma, say, to the mother at the time.
You know, any time that there's a trauma, it doesn't mean we're going to dissociate or disconnect or fragment and live with that through our lives. The important thing is that when something traumatic happens, that it is repaired, right? So we do have a certain amount of malleability. I wouldn't say infants are necessarily resilient, they're malleable. And so if they have a frightening experience in birth, but there's love and care and safety there right after, they're going to be okay. And if the mother is right there holding it, it's going to be okay. And because the baby is really living from the infant's nervous system. When a baby, the first 6 months of a baby's life, right, that nervous system isn't fully developed. So they need the mother. They need the mother to learn how to self-soothe. You know, if they're left on their own, their nervous system actually won't develop really, really well, not to its greatest potential, to be able to self-soothe ourselves. That's why it becomes so difficult then to feel emotions like anger and rage or sadness and grief, because our nervous system hasn't developed enough to allow us to really be able to calm down once we've started to feel them. You know, so then we can maybe always be hyper, you know, going.
So, thanks. I totally connect with all the presence with our children that we have to provide. The question I am interested in is a conversation I've had recently with several people, is breastfeeding, for example. I mean, this idea of giving the kids or the children, the infants, everything they possibly desire. Obviously, there's an extreme version of that where they become reliant and you're not actually helping them because they become somehow dysfunctional through overgiving. So one of my questions is breastfeeding. A recent conversation is a woman saying, I'll breastfeed until the child doesn't want to breastfeed anymore. Now, I've spent a lot of time in India, and in India they breastfeed till 7, 8, 9 years old, which for me is a little strange, especially culturally, but it's strange from potentially a social interaction point. Are you suggesting that we should move into a culture which does allow those sort of things? Or are you suggesting that there is a point where the parent literally takes a stance and says, actually, Tommy, you're 5 now, we're going to move off my boobs?
I think that the amount of breastfeeding or nursing is individual between a mother and child. I think the first 6 to 8 months of life, give them everything you've got. Just give them everything you've got. You know, you want an infant, you want this new soul, this essence, this being to come into a body and experience safety so it can live here to experience life. And I think the first 6 months are crucial. You know, the first year is really crucial. And then it's a personal, cultural choice on how long you nurse, you know, how you attune to the child. Not everybody has the choice to be able to do that. there's a lot of things in our culture, that prevent that. Some people have to go to work straight away. There's not always a parent that can stay home. Some infants have to be put into places where there's lots of infants and there's not enough care. I mean, there's a reality happening in our culture that can prevent the greatest nurturance of our children. But I think through education and some simple shifts, we can begin to shift that, right? Awareness, education, talking about it. Because again, consciousness and culture are co-evolving, and we would really benefit from an embodied culture, especially where we're headed. The ability to feel and connect, right, into our wholeness and with nature and the cosmos. Yeah. Yes?
There is a story that during the American Indian Wars, when the prisoners, when the Indians made prisoners of the white people didn't want to go back. But when the Indians got captured by the white people, they wanted to get the hell out of there as soon as they could. They wanted to get away immediately. I don't know if it's true in all cases, but that is in American history.
Yeah, interesting. So there was a delay with my talk's beginning. I'm going to try and allow the people behind me to catch up, so I'm not going to make them wait 10 minutes. But I would like to answer some questions, if there's any more. So yes.
I just want to clarify this, and then I maybe have a follow-up question. Did you say that this neglect as an infant sometimes gets transferred into intellect?
No, when there is trauma in infancy, and we dissociate. Sometimes we dissociate or connect more with the mind and live from the place of the mind because the body's been an unsafe place to live. Or we disconnect from the body and the mind and are living more in what we call spiritual ethereal realms. Right? Not to discount them, it's just not embodied.
So it's not safe to say that a lot of brilliant people had...
No. I mean, that would be, no, not at all. Yeah, no, brilliant, no.
Are you going to be dealing at all with children who grew up in trauma, that while they were in the biological home, that they were traumatized physically, sexually, emotionally?
Am I going to be dealing with it? You mean in my talk?
Yeah.
No. That was going to be too broad. I'd love to. I could stand and talk about this for days, but I thought just neglect is something we can make a difference about today. Abuse is a much bigger and vaster problem to address, very important too. And the healing process can be the same. And so, to end, we can heal. We can come back, just like this gentleman I told you about in the story. We can come back to the body. We can feel our authentic aliveness, and we can live the life that, we were here to live with our full potentiality like he's doing now. Yes?
How to get in touch with the anger, to heal?
It's different for everyone. But I would say the best way to do it is in a relationship, either in the safety of a loving relationship or a therapeutic relationship, because trauma is typically relationally, so it's best to heal it relationally. And to be able to sit with somebody that if your anger comes up, or whoever's anger comes up, it can be contained in a very safe environment. You don't want to be triggering somebody else's anger when your anger comes up and so forth. So finding somebody who's familiar with embodied work that resolves trauma and doing it in a safe environment. Yeah. So I'm going to wind up so we're not too late. And thank you so much for coming. Enjoy the rest of the conference.